Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Tell me if you've had this experience in your life. You've gone out and you've pattern recognized something. As an intuitive, I'm talking to you intuitives right now. You've speculated on something that's going on, whether it's with other people at work or maybe a business idea or something. You have a gut level idea of what's going on. And then the real world doesn't bear that out to be true. And you're like, man, my gut was off on this. And then you have another experience, maybe a week later, very similar. You've got a gut idea about how things are going to go down. And because of your previous experience, you're like, I don't know, should I trust what my gut's telling me? Should I trust what my intuition's telling me? I feel a little insecure about this. And you don't speak up, you don't posit an idea because you're a little leery about it. And then sure enough, the thing you were speculating on ends up being true. And you're like, oh man, I should have trusted my gut on this one. What's wrong? Where's my calibration on this? Today we want to talk about, as an intuitive, how do you know when to trust your gut? How do you know when to trust your intuition? How do you know when to not trust it? And some ideas on showing up to the world as an intuitive and bringing your best foot forward in that process.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the most difficult entry points for people who discover that they're an intuitive. This idea of whether or not it's, if it's your wiring, if it's how your mind is wired to experience reality, then being able to trust your natural wiring is kind of a big deal. It's a pretty big deal. And unlike people who have a sensory preference in the Myers-Briggs system, people with a sensory preference, they want reliable and verifiable information. So that means that they're not going to be making these speculative leaps. If they can get away with it, they're going to go look for trusted, valued information. And so they, by default, have a trust mechanism built into their perceiving processes. But intuitives don't. That's what defines them as intuitives. So if the very definition of how your brain is wired is that you can't seek reliable, verifiable pieces of information that support your speculative or intuitive leaps, then exactly how are you, when are you supposed to trust this? When are you supposed to trust your foundational, fundamental wiring? And when are you not supposed to trust it? I think that's a big question a lot of intuitives have.
Yeah, if you're a new listener and you're like, what in the world are you guys talking about? We're actually talking about the way that your mind learns new information and perceives the world. And if you use an intuitive process, technical names extroverted intuition or introverted intuition, we've nicknamed them exploration and perspectives. If you see the world this way, if you learn information and you perceive the world using one of these intuitive processes, this is what we're talking about. You, by definition, are looking for patterns of patterns. You're into speculative thinking. You like to think and speculate about what is, by definition, behind the curtain, which makes it not verifiable, not completely observable, and you're making connections between disparate things. You're pattern recognizing. We call it advanced pattern recognition. If you'd like to get a deep dive into this, which will make this podcast way more useful to you, especially if you're a new listener, we've recorded a podcast, actually a series of podcasts, probably about a year ago, around this idea of intuition. We talk about, one of the podcasts goes into the very specifics around the two styles of intuition, the extroverted style, the introverted style. We break those down and we unpack what that looks like for you. And so that would be a great framework for you to have under your belt as we begin this discussion today about how we know when to trust this process that you show up to the world using as an intuitive, someone who has a preference for learning and perceiving the world using an intuitive process.
Yeah. So that's actually a really good place to start because it helps you parse out which style of intuition you're using, and that's going to help inform whether or not you should be trusting your intuitive process. Intuition is a talent that some people possess because some people are wired to be driven to take these and make these speculative leaps. Then we call it the cost of specialization a lot. The cost of specialization is that when you focus on a certain handful of things, you're by definition not looking at other things. And so you end up being highly specialized in one arena. People who are wired for intuition have a tendency to be, to have the cost of specialization be focused on speculative intuitive leaps. And so by definition, they get worse at other stuff, but they get really good at that. And the opposite is true. If you're surrounded by people who have a different way of being wired, then their cost of specialization is going to be that they're not looking at these speculative leaps. They're not trying to figure out what's going on behind the curtain. So they're not going to get particularly good at it. But what's nice about this theory of the cost of specialization is it shows that things that are a natural talent can't just stay in the arena of talent. They actually have to be focused on. They have to be exercised. You have to put concerted effort into them to build them into a skill. And that's actually how you end up getting really good at anything. Even if you have a natural talent for it, you've got to focus on it. It's got to be something that you are actually working on improving. It can't just be a tool you use. It has to be a tool that you practice with. And practice means some failure. It means that you're going to, you're not just going to be hitting a ball down a field. You're actually going to be putting a 3-inch hole at the end of so many hundreds of yards and attempting to get this tiny little, ball into that slightly larger hole at the end of the green, and you have a golf club. So just hitting balls with a club, that's using a golf club. But actually attempting to get that golf ball into the hole at the end of so many hundreds of yards, that's actually now exercising and practicing the skill of golf. So intuition works very similarly. Some of us are wired to have a natural proclivity to think in that way, and have the cost of specialization be that we focus on speculation and pattern recognition and trying to figure out what's going on where you can't verify it. However, we can't just rely on our natural talent. We actually have to build skill and exercise that talent. And once we build that skill, then we get a better calibration for when we can and cannot trust our intuition. So the starting point is figuring out what style of intuition you use, because that will help inform how you can exercise that particular brand of intuition.
If you've been an intuitive all your life, you have this learning style, this perceiving process, but you're in a world that doesn't really support that. What's going to end up happening? Let's say you're in a family and you're the only intuitive in your family. You're not going to really be encouraged to practice that process. It's something that comes natural to you, but you're going to be encouraged to rely on more sensory information, more reliable information. So what happens is you don't practice this skill, you don't practice this natural talent of yours to develop it into a skill, and you do what we call here at Personality Hacker, which is blend. You begin to blend in with the world around you. The entire world is mostly set up for people that are sensors, that are not intuitives. And so by blending, you're actually allowing this process that you naturally possess to atrophy. And we're talking about today, what Antonia's talking about is start taking control of that process and think about ways that you can begin developing that as a skill.
Yeah, what's interesting about learning about cognitive functions in the Myers-Briggs system is that you learn that all of us have both sensory and intuitive processes within us. So it's not like it's so foreign to us that we can't sympathize with a sensory way of looking at the world, and vice versa. Every sensor, even if they're leading with a sensory function, like that's their dominant function and their intuitive function is their inferior, there's a part of them that gets what it means to trust, let's use the phrase trust your gut. All of us have a part of us that, the hair raises up on the back of our neck if we think we're being watched. Or you walk into your house and it just feels off, right? Yeah. Like an object has been moved or whatever. And then, you get kind of this sixth sense feeling. All of us experience that. We all have an intuitive, ability or intuitive wiring within us. But again, it goes back to that specialization piece, which is when you are wired to be intuitive dominant, that's what you're wired to focus on. And so what ends up happening, I think, for a lot of intuitives is that because sensors do get intuitive hunches, but they haven't spent all their time and effort focused on it, then it doesn't pan out for them as much. They'll get an intuitive hunch, and if they go with it without doing any verifying, which is what they should be doing as sensors, if they go with their hunch and they haven't done a lot of verification, then it almost feels like a mixed bag if it pans out for them, because that's not where they've been building, their skill. And so what you end up getting as an intuitive is a bunch of feedback from sensors that will discourage you from using your intuitive process, because when they use theirs, they don't always have good results. It's a mixed bag for them. So there's enough ability to sympathize. There's enough ability to speak the same language so that you think the other person is getting where you're coming from. And you might hand over a lot of power to them. You might hand over this, this feeling like, well, they're older than me. They must really know what they're talking about. If they're discouraging me from, making decisions based on my gut or on my hunches, they're in a position of authority. They might really know what they're talking about. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many intuitives become self-doubting or they become rebellious, because they want to use this intuitive process and the world is telling them not to. So There's a lot more to this idea of when and when not to trust your guts or trust your intuition or trust your hunch or however you want to say it. There's a lot more to it than just building the skill itself. You also have to be able to close off or silence those voices that are causing you to doubt your intuition because the person who implanted that idea couldn't sympathize on the same level with you. So a lot of times why we doubt our intuition is not because of us, but it's because of outside voices. So you've got multiple layers here. So do I trust my gut despite the fact that everybody's telling me not to, or I feel like everybody's telling me not to? Do I trust it anyway? And once you can get past that first layer of like, well, I think I'm going to silence those voices. I think I'm not going to hand that much power over to other people. I think I'm going to go ahead and focus on my intuition and build it up. And I think I am going to start trusting it, even if it leads me astray sometimes, which it will. It always will, right? Nothing is 100%. Nothing is a guarantee, and all skill needs to be built over time through making mistakes. But it's that first decision point of, yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and do it. I think I'm going to go ahead and trust my intuitive process, even if other people who think they know what I'm doing are making statements like it's a bad idea.
So what we're looking to do here is create a discipline around your intuition. I mean, all skill comes from building discipline, and we're going to talk about 5 ideas, 5 techniques or tool sets that we think will help you vet your intuition and be able to trust it more. And we're going to break those down now for you to be able, as an intuitive, to begin working with this and building skill around it.
Yeah, again, it's going from talent to skill. Talent is an inherent ability, but skill is development over time. It's exercising it. And so the only real way to trust your intuition is to build skill. Like in our program, we have a program called Intuitive Awakening. And in the program, we have a whole section on like when to know when to trust your intuition. And one of the things we mentioned in the program is start to see your intuition as a friend. We have friends that we may or may not trust those people in different contexts. There are certain friends that I would completely and 100% trust with my child, and I wouldn't particularly trust them with my taxes. And there are other friends that I would 100% trust almost every piece of information that comes out of their mouth, but I wouldn't trust their hunches about people, right? So we understand our intuition like we understand our friends. We can see growth and development happen over time, and then we give more trust to our friends, and we give more trust to our intuitive process like we would to a friend that's developing over time. So start to build a relationship with your intuition like it is a friend of yours, and as it builds skill, hand over more trust like you would with a friend. So the first stage step recommendation for trusting your intuition is have a lot of information about whatever it is you're attempting to make speculative leaps upon. So what that means is we like to call intuition the desire to know what's going on behind the curtain. And the only way to know what's going on behind the curtain is to pick up clues as to what's going on in front of the curtain. Because if you walk into a completely blank room, like a void, and there happens to be a curtain there, there's no way that you can possibly guess what's behind it because you have absolutely no clues in front of you. So the only way to really use intuition to make these speculative leaps, right? Like these abstract, speculative, what-if leaps, is by seeing the evidence that's already presented and then combining ideas, understanding novelty from what is already known, being able to take it to a bigger level. But you already got to start with what's there. So if you're having intuitive leaps about subjects, that you have zero information on, then those intuitive leaps are probably not very high quality. And if you happen to be right, it's probably completely on accident or just total dumb sheer luck. However, if it's in a field in which you are an expert or you're gaining expertise and you're fueling your mind with lots of pieces of information, then the intuitive speculative leaps you're making about that information are probably going to be quite high quality because you're getting a lot of information around the terrain of what's in front of the curtain. And the more information you get about what's in front of the curtain, the better your leaps are going to be as to what's going on behind the curtain.
Yeah, and you've already been doing this to some degree. If you've grown up in a sensor world, which we all have, especially if your family and friends have been sensors, you've had some skill set in working with the reliable, working with the data sets that are there. And in fact, the people around you would love helping you get some more of that data, some more of those facts. So feed your mind. Another thing this can also look like too is if you're working on a problem, let's say you're working on a new business model or something, reading a lot of different articles and books, maybe in disparate industries than your own, for example. This is just one example. You begin to feed your subconscious mind, your unconscious mind, with a bunch of information about what's already out there, what business models are already working for the industry you're in, for example. And then you also read maybe outside your industry of similar industries that could be somewhat like your industry. And you're feeding your mind with all these disparate pieces of information that already exist. And as your intuition begins to take that and now make patterns out of it, it's going to be a better pattern because it has more territory that it's taking in. So this is kind of what we're talking about. This is not kind of what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about, is getting the facts, getting the data for your intuition to work with.
Some intuitive types are more likely to do this, to collect as much information as humanly possible. I've noticed that the people who lead with the perspectives process, or what's technically named introverted intuition, are researchers. They're lifelong, can't ever stop, will never have enough information researchers. And then there's other intuitive types that might not be as insistent on doing research. They might just allow themselves to go with their gut and just keep going. So if you're one of the types that has a tendency to do a lot of research and you're not trusting your gut, it's because you may have developed a fear that you never have enough information. And that's not exactly accurate. A lot of those fears are not really around not having enough information. They're mostly a fear about making mistakes upon when you get to the moment of implementation. And if that's the case, it's not actually your inability to trust your intuition. It's your fear of being not perfect or failure or whatever. And those are two different things. So that's another piece of it, is that if you have hesitation, it might not actually be a fear of trusting intuition. It might be something else that you're conflating with fearing your intuition. So be on lookout for that. And for those of you who are an intuitive type that completely trust your intuition, but don't do the necessary research, let us gently recommend that you go down the research road. Our intuition is a great tool, and it's wonderful to be able to trust it. However, if you've never been a stockbroker ever, and all of a sudden you get a hunch on what to buy on the NASDAQ, and you believe that you were led by something else, spiritual, or your intuition was, guiding you, and you happen to be right, that probably was more luck than anything else. So there's also a caution around trusting intuitive leaps when you actually don't have information behind you. So my recommendation is to have a good balance of these two. Definitely do your research, but if you have done your research and you have a good amount of information, then please feel free to trust your intuition, because that's what it's there for.
Okay, so step number 2 is watch for your own cognitive biases. And we all show up to the world with preconceived notions about how things work. And we all come from so many different backgrounds, so many different experiences. And over time, we begin to create biases around people, around things, around ways of thinking, worldviews. And as we bring those to the world, sometimes that can hijack our intuition's pure process, because as we almost want to see a speculative leap because we have a preconceived bias already programmed in our brains. So one of the things to do here is recognize those biases and try to call them out in your own life. Let's say you've got difficulty with, a certain type of person in your life, and this person keeps showing up over and over again. This kind of person shows up over and over again, and you have a difficulty with them. So as you're intuitively speculating on a person like this person that you know in your life, or people that you know in your life, and you have some negative feelings about it, or your intuition's coming with some negative conclusions, watch, is this a cognitive bias I have around people like this that I'm projecting onto the data I've collected and the intuitive leaps I'm making? Am I speculating badly because I've got a bias that I'm bringing to the table? So this is something to really watch for.
Yeah, you could probably sort of distill these down to 2 different major biases that people tend to use. The first one is wishful thinking, and the second one is a fear bias. So maybe I jumped the gun a little bit when I was talking about, certain types that want to do a lot of research but don't want to get into action, and that's more about fear than it is about trusting their intuition. But both of these biases, both the fear bias and the wishful thinking bias, and they'll be the preferred biases of different types, right? Different intuitive types or personality types. But generally, when we're wanting to believe something and we need something a little nebulous or abstract to support us, as intuitives, we do have a tendency to then exploit this tool of intuition and allow it to be the thing that supports what we already wanted to believe, which is my intuition is telling me that I shouldn't act when I should, and my intuition is telling me to act when maybe I'm not ready for it yet. So as long as you recognize and identify your personal favorite biases, and the Intuitive Awakening program breaks down for intuitive thinkers and intuitive feelers some of the preferred biases of the two different styles, right? But you're going to have one that's your favorite. And one great way of figuring out what your favorite biases are is to go to the Wikipedia article on cognitive biases and just do like a couple-hour project of scanning through all these different biases and figuring out which are the ones that you have a tendency to run toward. And so if you know what your favorite go-to tool is or go-to bias is, when you're using intuition and you get a hunch or a speculative leap, the first thing you can do is go, is this somehow confirming that bias, right? Am I using this as a confirmation bias for whatever my favorite biases are? And if the answer is, I don't really see a correlation between the two, you're probably okay. But if you start seeing a lot of correlations between the two, then that might be an intuitive project, right? That might be yet another project to really focus on, is not only information gathering, but also vetting for those biases.
So skill number 3, or point number 3 about trusting your intuition, building your intuition, is about tracking your progress. You know, as you are testing out the ideas and intuitive leaps of logic and speculation that you have in your life, you need to record when you get it right and when you get it wrong. And what we'd actually recommend you do is write down, either journal it, in a narrative fashion, or even record numbers if it's more data-driven, like, math-type driven speculations, but record what feedback you're getting from the outside world, from the real world, about your speculative intuitive leaps. Because now you're building up a catalog of recorded data that you can now vet against.
Yeah, it's basically like an intuition diary.
Yeah.
You're recording your speculative leaps, your hunches, what your gut is telling you, and you now can reference back when you chose to act on an intuition, when you chose not to, how that worked out for you, what are your batting averages, basically. How much have you personally built the skill of intuition? And keeping a diary will help with that. It also encourages you to write down your intuitive leaps so that you can reference them later if you're like, wow, I forgot that I thought about that. That was such a great idea. And so there's a lot of benefits to, especially if this is a skill you are currently building. If you're not somebody who already trusts their intuition, keeping a diary is a great way of recording some of these great concepts, these great ideas that maybe is just sort of germinating in your mind right now. And later you can reference back to them and go, oh, that was a really good idea. And now that I've learned more about my topic, or now that I've learned a little bit more about myself, I would tweak it in this way. So you get a running list of these intuitive, gut hunches. And at the same time, you are also able to track your batting average. So it's a really good idea to carry a diary.
Yeah, one of the tools I use just as a practical tool is one of those moleskin journals. It's a really easy leather-bound journal. It's moleskin. You can get it like a Barnes & Noble or ordered online. And often at night, I'll just take a pen and I'll write down different thoughts and ideas I have about what, business trends are coming, different things we want to do with Personality Hacker the business. And I looked back over my notes, I think from about 2 years ago, and some of the business stuff that we're implementing now and some of the trends we're seeing. For example, I've noticed a trend in everything going to subscription models. Everybody's in business, you subscribe now to, anywhere from zip cars to, if you're a wealthy person, airplanes, to Dollar Shave Club, like any of these things are subscription models. I have a note from about 2 years ago about subscription models and how I think there's some trending going this way for certain types of products and things. And now we're looking at ways that we can incorporate some of those ideas into our business going forward in the future. So it's a real basic thing. It's not super intuitive leap to make, but it is something that I was seeing a trend toward and made some notes of. And now I'm tracking how the prediction of some of those trends I saw are coming true in some industries that weren't necessarily as obvious back then.
Well, and what's nice about that for you is that you actually have struggled a little bit with whether or not you should be trusting your intuition, and being able to reference things like that from the past where you're like, wow, I was spot on about this. I really predicted this trend. I in some detail that ended up coming to fruition, and I couldn't have possibly known that to be true. And so now what you've done is you've been able to rest a little bit more into your intuition. You've been able to rest into the fact that you can predict trends, and then that's informed a lot of our decisions right now, which is you're like, yeah, I don't know if I feel good about this. I don't have all the specifics of why I don't feel good. I just don't feel good about this. And then we'll slow our decision making down. We'll take stock because we have learned to trust in your abilities to read trends. So I think it's been really helpful for you. And if you carry a diary, if you write down your intuitions, if you choose to go the journal method, and you're finding that your intuition is not serving you, that your hunches are not accurate, what's great about that is you can now start to go inside yourself and go, okay, well, if I'm intuitive and this is how I'm wired, what are the things that are getting in my way? Like I'm actually designed to do this well. And if I'm not doing it well, maybe I've got some personal stuff coming up. Maybe I've got, some personal interests or some anxieties that are distorting my perceptions. So this is a really good way to be able to do a little introspection as well and, continue to build confidence in the areas that you actually nailed it.
Step number 4, the next step, after you begin just to track what's happening, you journal it, you write it down, keep it on a spreadsheet, whatever's going on for you, and literally track it, or at least pay attention and remember things. You want to test iterate. You want to take this data and say, okay, did this actually bear out? And this is pretty much a pragmatic, straightforward process of testing your speculations against the real world. So you've tracked it, now you're testing it to say, okay, what I speculated, is this coming true? Does this seem to be the trend or the pattern that I'm actually seeing? And so you want to test, iterate all of the things that you're recording, and it's pretty much a straightforward step. And then the final step is you want to seek more opportunities to implement this entire process. So we've talked about just getting the facts, getting the data is step number 1. Watching out for confirmation bias, things that you already bring to the table of your biases and things you're going to project onto your leaps of intuition. What are those and how can you watch for them? And then just simply tracking what you speculate and record it. And then test, iterate that. And then look for opportunities to repeat this cycle. Number 5 is just begin to process through this over and over again. And if you put intention around this in particular, you're going to see your intuition begin to develop more and more skill. And you're going to get better and better at predicting things, seeing what's behind the curtain, and making those intuitive leaps in your life.
Seeking opportunities to implement more intuition means slightly different things if you're a perspectives user or an exploration user. If perspectives is your preferred form of intuition, then that means you're going to want to not force the issue. You're going to want to allow yourself some time to germinate over your ideas. Sometimes people who use perspectives or introverted intuition get their best ideas when they're sleeping, and they'll wake up and they'll have the solution come to them in a dream, or they just sort of allow their unconscious mind to work and then eventually an answer pops up. Whereas exploration users, people who use extroverted intuition, are far more likely to get great ideas when they're engaged in a conversation, like a green light conversation where they're just allowed to go back and forth and really idea generate and allow their intuition to have sort of a cross-pollination platform with another person. So whichever style you use, get intimate with how that style of intuition is done best, and especially for you as a unique person, and then give yourself opportunities to implement that intuition. And I would say, really, it's important. We personally believe that it's important to build the skill of intuition, especially if you're an intuitive. But it's really important to not devalue this gift, to not allow messaging from the outside world to discourage you from using this. We have a suspicion that this is going to be one of the most important skills or tools that we use as we just scramble to keep up with the technology that we as humans have innovated. We've created this technology from intuition. And in order to engage in this world and harness it and really be able to work with the technology that we have innovated, we're going to have to use commensurate intuition to do that too. So intuition created the technology, and intuition is going to have to be how we solve some of the challenges that have come up from being in such a technological age. So just as sort of a one final word on intuition, Buckminster Fuller called these hunches or these intuitive leaps, he called it cosmic fishing. And he said, you throw a line out there and you see what you get. And the important thing is not to ignore it. He said, too many people get hunches and then just go have a cigarette and forget what those hunches are. So think of this as cosmic fishing. Think of it as sometimes you get a real one in and sometimes you don't. And as with everything, it is skill development. So go through this list of different steps to take to really develop the skill of intuition and become a much better hunch fisherman.
Yeah, what is really at the heart and soul of what we are all about here at Personality Hacker is empowering you as an intuitive. We want to see an intuitive awakening happen where we come together as a community of like minds, people who use this preference, this perceiving and learning preference of intuition, whether it's introverted or extroverted intuition, it doesn't matter. We want to see people use this to solve the world's challenges. I mean, the world is colliding. There are systems and processes and technologies and everything that's coming online so fast, so furious, whether it's culture or politics or money systems. And we're going to need people that can read situations quickly, can pattern recognize, can speculate about what's coming next. And you're part of that community. You're part of that tribe of people that we believe are going to be transformational leaders in the future. And transformational leaders like tomorrow. I mean, not just like the distant future, but tomorrow, starting immediately. So Antonia mentioned earlier in the podcast this program we have called Intuitive Awakening. It's an 8-part program that really goes into all the stuff we've talked about, but in much more detail. We talk about cognitive biases. We talk about how to find intuitive friends. We talk about what intuition is, the differences between introvert and extrovert intuition in a much more granular, detailed way. I recommend you at least check out that program. If you're intuitive, you're here listening with us, and you're a part of this conversation, I would encourage you to look at that program because I believe as intuitives, we have to step up. It is time. And I think that program is a great tool. The other thing I would recommend that you do as an intuitive is come over and join our new Intuitive Awakening Facebook group. It's open for everyone. There's no cost for it. You can join. All you have to do is, submit that you want to join. We'll approve you. You can be a part of a community of like minds that's growing every day of other intuitives just like you. And we talk about things like vetting our intuition, seeing how accurate it is. We talk about finding other tribe members. A lot of people on this community have been talking about meetup groups and connecting with each other in real time, wherever they are in the world. That group is growing every day. And I'd love for you to come over and be a part of that group with us because we're creating this tribe of transformational leaders who are intuitives, who think like you, and we need you a part of this group because every voice is valid here. Every voice needs to be heard, and we can grow this community together. So come over to facebook.com/personality hacker. You can find some information on joining that Facebook group over there. Also, twitter.com/personality hack. If you like what you hear here on iTunes, we'd love to have you rate us and subscribe. Be a part of the conversation every week. We want to have you a part of it, so subscribe to this channel.
Yeah, we discovered recently that iTunes algorithm, we don't know this for sure, but it seems to be that the more you receive consistent ratings and reviews, the more priority they give you to encourage other people to listen to your podcast. So if you'd love to give back to the show in some way, if you've gotten some value from the podcast and you enjoy us, please go to iTunes and leave a rating and review. And like Joel mentioned, you can subscribe. You can also subscribe on various Android platforms. I'm not really sure how their rating and review system goes, but I know that you can subscribe to them and just kind of let us know that you like us.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation this week with us. We love having you each week right here on this podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.